By this story of fantasy, may this faded world be painted anew.
So right away, I need to start this video off by saying Metaphor isn't just one of the best games I've played this year, it's one of the best games I've played in the last 20 years, and I really didn't expect that. I went into the game expecting a decent turn-based RPG that scratched that itch, and while it certainly did that with its various mechanics inside and out of combat, the story was so good it ended up being my favorite part about the game, which is wild to me. The last game where I truly felt this way was probably Tales of Berseria, which even now as I sit here, I can't stop thinking about Metaphor's story and characters. Which while I will get into why I love these aspects of the game so much here in a minute, I first want to say that there will be spoilers in this video. Now, I'm not going to be showing something like the final boss, but outside of that, there will be countless spoilers when it comes to characters, locations, and enemies. So consider this your one and only warning. Normally, I would try to keep spoilers to a minimum, and even with this warning, I may still try my best to do that, but since the game has been out for over a month now, and there's so much I want to discuss about the game, both good and bad, it just feels a little unavoidable. But with that said, it's time to dive into this wonderfully crafted world of Metaphor and explain why I love it so much despite some of its obvious flaws.
My name is Leon Stroll de Haliatus. My home and my family were taken from me. I am the last of my house. I am the last of my noble bloodline.
Now, it's no secret RPGs are my favorite genre of games to play. I grew up grinding on games like Final Fantasy, Chrono Trigger, and so on as a kid, which led to me loving these fantasy-style worlds more than any other where you're chasing down this big bad evil villain that is attempting to take over or destroy everything with some crazy reasoning. But with that said, I do feel RPGs sometimes get too trapped in this cycle where it's so formulaic story-wise. When you have played one of them, you have played like 100 of them, because they are so predictable, you can see what's going to happen from a mile away. But with Metaphor, that all goes out the window with the attention to detail in almost every aspect of the story that has a very heavy foundation based on topics like politics, racism, and the hardships in someone's life. This isn't a story about good versus evil. It's a story about that gray area where you have to ask yourself if you can really blame someone for the actions they take. This is so well conveyed as you make your way through the main plot of Metaphor. Which this plot follows a young man and his fairy companion named Gallica as they set out to break a curse that has been placed on the kingdom's missing prince, who everyone outside of a close circle believes to be dead. Now, if this is all the plot entailed, I would say this is your typical fantasy story, but the prince's father, the king, gets assassinated by a man named Luis, who's actually your target since he is believed to be the one who cursed the prince. But the reason he assassinated the king was because he hoped to gain control of the kingdom. But that plan gets flipped upside down when the king's death unleashes a magic across the kingdom that makes it so the next king will be decided by the will of the people. So whoever they believe in the most will be named king on the day the magic spell ends. So now you have various people across the land vying for the people's favor in hopes of being king. Now, just at a base level, this is an awesome idea for a story, but then you get all the layers added on top of it that really takes it to the next level for me. For starters, the main character you play as, which the game gives you the option to name whatever you want. I named him Will. From what I understood, this is his canon English name. Whenever games have a canon name for a character, I always go with it. Some people might find that silly, but just something I like to do. Not to mention, I feel like the name Will is very fitting for the theme of the game, since you're constantly battling for the will of the people. But anyways, at a certain point in the game, the Sanctus Church, which is the home of the main religion across the kingdom, holds a tournament to help anyone battling to become the next king gain favor with the people by putting all of them through various challenges. Now, Will can't ignore this tournament because he knows the prince is still alive, and killing Louis may be the only way to break the curse that's been placed on him. So he enters the tournament knowing Louis' goal is to be king, so by finding ways to stand out in this tournament may help him get closer to Louis. But the king's magic prevents contestants from attacking each other, so Will has to find a way to bring down Louis while navigating all of these challenges, restrictions, and a looming deadline of when the king will be crowned, while also understanding that while some other contestants are in it for power, others are battling to end the suffering that their people endure. Which I have to say, I love Luis as a villain, and one of the biggest reasons I believe isn't just because he is so well written, but because he is so prominent in the story. He's not just some guy that pops out halfway through the game or at the end to fight you or declare he has secretly been the villain the whole time. No, you are constantly engaging with him in various cutscenes, boss battles, and so on. So by the end of the game, you don't see him as just a villain that needs to be defeated. You see a man that never recovered from past trauma that led to him going down this insane path. Then of course, no story is complete without a good cast of characters, and Will's 7 companions that you meet as you progress through the game along with the various followers who support him are all incredibly written. This is like one of the few games where I can say I didn't dislike a single character. All of their story arcs and personalities are very well done. You have someone like Stroll, who is battling to restore his noble family's name and save his people years after his home was devastated by a human attack, which are like these giant twisted monsters that play a pivotal role in the overarching story, but he battles with coming to grip with how he acted towards his parents before they died in that attack, and who they wanted him to be in life. You have Hulkenberg, who was a former guard of the prince trapped in this cycle of blaming herself for what happened to him, and trying to find a way to repent. There's Heisme, who's an outcast of his village, who is battling to find a way to get past the death of his son. There's Gallica the fairy, who actually kind of beats the trope of being that annoying tiny companion that's terrible to listen to, who's actually meaningful to the story and even combat at times, though she does have her moments where you want to roast her over the fire. But jokes aside, I could go on and on about each companion. All of these characters are awesome with story arcs that truly feel complete. None of these characters feel like they were ignored in any way, and that's something the game does very well in general. The entire time I was making my way through the story, I kept asking myself, I wonder if this is going to get explained. Sure enough, it kept happening, and by the end of the game, I felt like I fully understood exactly what happened almost down to the last little detail. I mean, even the music in the game has an explanation, as it being magic cast by Gallica on Will. But at this point, you would probably think I don't have any issues with the story at all. Surprisingly though, I actually do. First off, Will, at least for me, never felt like the main character 90% of the time while I made my way through the main story part of Metaphor, and it drove me nuts. There are so many times in either confrontations or big story moments where I was waiting for him to step up and lay down the law against either Luis or whoever else the cast was dealing with. But almost every step of the way, you have either Stroll, Gallica, or someone else stepping up to say something, and it's moments like this that made me wonder why he was even there. Like, don't get me wrong, Will has some great moments, definitely when it comes to the interactions he has with his companions and followers, since he basically jumpstarts everyone's story arcs of redemption or finding their true purpose in the game. But for him being the main character and having such a pivotal role in the story, he just didn't say enough in the main story moments for me. Then the other issue I have is kind of a story and gameplay mix issue with the start of the game, all the way up to when the tournament for the crown begins, which is the fact that this section of the game is such a slow burn, and I don't believe it represents the game's true experience well. The story to a certain degree comes off like any other fantasy story, despite its stellar writing, and feels very predictable, like the endless obvious death flags you get for a certain character. But as you get past this opening act, the game has some insane twists in the story that really will take you by surprise and makes the story anything but predictable, that evolves into so much more than your typical fantasy story. Then gameplay wise, even though the game is introducing you to all the mechanics you will be engaging with throughout your playthrough of the game, it doesn't represent the true gameplay loop of the game well because of how restrictive it is. The opening act is very linear compared to how majority of the game's experience will actually be like. Which really sucks to me, because if you're someone who obviously plays a lot of RPGs, this probably won't be a big deal to you. At least for me, even though I felt this way about the opening of the game, I still really enjoyed the build up and pacing to when you finally hit that moment of freedom. But I could easily see someone who isn't big into RPGs or into this style of RPGs bouncing off of the game in this opening act because of these issues, regardless of the quality. Like, as stupid as this is to say, because I know people get tired of hearing this phrase, but Metaphor truly is a game that gets better the further into it you get. But with that said, the game is more than just a story. It is indeed a video game, and there's so much I enjoy about the actual gameplay, with a few things I wish could have had a little more spice to it. So the actual gameplay of Metaphor is your classic turn-based style system, where your party gets a turn, and then the enemy gets a turn. Which along with that, they have all your usual stuff you would expect in an RPG. items you can use in and out of battle, various status effects, different kinds of weapons, armor, and accessories you can equip with a variety of effects and so on, but they do add in a combination of mechanics seen in various other games to make these systems a lot more dynamic and fresh feeling. This first starts outside of battle actually. You can sneak up and attack or combo an enemy to stun them before going into battle with them. This gives you a huge advantage since it can not only massively cut down the enemy's HP, but it also stuns them in battle, as well giving you a chance to get off some extra actions as long as you don't knock them out of the stun with those actions, since attacking an enemy can end the effect early and cause you to fail to take advantage of that advantage. So basically, ideally, depending on the strength of the enemies, what I would like to do on an opening turn of a fight where I nailed a stun is cast buffs or debuffs to prep my party and weaken the enemy before they get their turn skipped over, allowing me to follow up with an all-out attack that could easily end a lot of battles, definitely if I'm rocking the enemy's weakness. The reason I say this is because Metaphor has a system where if you nail an enemy's weakness or land a critical hit, you basically gain additional actions you can perform on your turn. So instead of, let's say, having 4 actions on your turn, you could potentially perform up to 8 or more. So you can see how taking advantage of all of these can greatly benefit you. Though, with that said, all of these things also apply to the enemies you fight as well. If an enemy lands an attack on you outside of battle, while your party won't be stunned like when you attack an enemy, they have a chance of being afflicted with a status effect called Anxiety that causes things like enemies not using up actions when attacking, which, when considering this status effect, along with the fact if they land an attack that one of your party members are weak to, they will gain additional actions. You can see how this can absolutely wreck your party. So you have a nice dynamic taking place outside of battle where you can have these high risk, high reward scenarios, definitely when playing on harder difficulties, which is truly apparent when tackling the various main and optional dungeons throughout the game. These dungeons basically have a variety of themes, or in a sense rules that if you don't respect them, can be very hard to get through, definitely if you go into them blind. Luckily, depending on what city you're in, you can go to a local tavern and pay an informant to get details on a dungeon or even a variety of other things, but these details might be something like exposing enemies' defenses or weaknesses, which I can't stress enough how important these can be, because if you go into a dungeon and try to brute force your way through with all the wrong kind of attacks, your party can be pretty helpless, since depending on an enemy's defenses, your attacks might heal them, do half the damage, get reflected back at you, and so on. But on the flip side, by exposing certain weaknesses or advantages, you can gain a leg up in battle by taking advantage of things like using money to distract enemies on their turns, or doing things like keeping enemies from having additional actions, thanks to doing something like keeping your party in the back row, which, since I'm crossing this mechanic, Metaphor has a row system that is pretty simple to understand but fun to use. While in battle, you can freely move wherever character you are currently choosing an action for to the front or back row, and these rows affect your characters differently depending on which one they are in. If they are in the front row, their attacks do additional damage, but if they are in the back row, their defenses will be greater. But along with that, like I just mentioned about the enemies, depending on what row your characters are in, enemies may react differently. Also, certain actions or attacks can only be performed based on what row your characters are in as well, so this just adds another dynamic to the overall combat system I absolutely love. I mean, I'm a big fan of Lost Odyssey's row system, so of course I'm going to like this. Anyways, to finally build just a little bit more on everything I've covered on the combat system, outside of some additional fun little systems like swapping out characters mid-battle or having an optional customizable auto-battle system, there is what I consider to be the main draw of the combat system, which is the Archetype class system. So these archetypes you unlock as you make your way through the game all have their own strengths and weaknesses, which any character can equip any of them outside of these special royal archetypes that are locked to each character, which I'll get to those after a bit. But basically, while a character like Juna might benefit more from using more magic-oriented archetypes like the mage, there's nothing stopping her from using others focused around more physical skills like Berserker. Then to build off of that, all the different archetypes have their own trees with better versions of said archetypes you can unlock. So something like the warrior archetype can evolve to be the swordmaster archetype. But with that said, Why would you want to have a character use an archetype if it doesn't really suit them? Well, there's a few good reasons for this. First is depending on what combination of archetypes you have in battle, you can use different synthesis moves where multiple characters team up for a special skill that can be tremendously useful in battle, along with the fact that if you have multiple of the same archetype in battle, you get bonuses to their stats. Next is as you level up your archetype through said battle, which is a separate level from your character's level that maxes out at 20, you unlock additional skills or passives for that archetype. But the nice thing about this is that you can then spend a currency called mag to learn those skills or passives to use with other archetypes, allowing you to really customize your characters when going into battle. Though I should mention, you can only equip up to 4 of any combination of skills or passives based on your bond level with whatever character is associated with that archetype, which is another thing we'll get into later. Anyway, then the other reason you want to be leveling up various archetypes with your characters is the fact that some of the best archetypes with the best passives or skills can only be unlocked after meeting certain conditions that involve leveling up certain archetypes, which includes these special royal archetypes that are specific to each character. Also, real quick, I should mention is that after meeting the requirements to unlock an archetype, you still have to spend the mag currency to unlock it. Though I always felt like I had plenty, definitely later on in the game since they have a great feature that made grinding easy, which is the fact that as you run around dungeons, if you're at a certain level compared to the enemies in the area, which can easily be checked by using Galaga's vision to see enemies' levels, you can just take out the enemies without ever going into battle. So this made any kind of grinding or farming I needed to do very easy, and I really wish more RPGs that are turn-based would use this. Plus, as a bonus, you could skip battle animations for everything so battles can go faster, which was also super nice for grinding reasons. Then finally, when it came to leveling up archetypes, they have a nice system where if you're using a max level archetype, they still earn XP that gets turned into an item that could be used to level up other archetypes. So you don't even actually have to use an archetype with a character if you really don't want to, which kind of goes against the overall archetype system's purpose, and leads to my biggest issue with the archetype system in general. As great as the idea behind them is, and I need to make clear, I never ever dislike engaging with the archetype system. I feel, and I hope I can describe this in a way that makes sense, but I feel that the idea behind this system is actively battling against itself. The reason I say this is as you make your way through the game, each character has an awakening that is so badass where they unlock a special archetype that is tied to the resolve that these characters show in these situations. So someone like Yufa awakens to the Summoner archetype, while someone like Juna awakens to the Masked Dancer archetype. And I'm using these two as an example because these archetypes both have special features to them. The Summoner archetype is built around summoning monsters in the battle, and you can craft new summons for the archetype by using different monster materials you get, while the Masked Dancer archetype can equip different masks that are craftable that give the Masked Dancer usable abilities from other archetypes. I love the idea behind these so much, it makes them feel so damn unique. Which is why I really wish instead of allowing all the characters to have access to every archetype, each character's archetypes had their own true special quirk with larger archetype trees. So instead of having all these different archetypes where half of them are pretty useless depending on the character, each character is more specialized into a role where everything you're doing for them makes that role deeper. I mean, those royal archetypes I mentioned that are specialized for each character are basically the ultimate versions of the initial character's awakenings, which is such a weird choice to make. Like, why make every archetype available to every character if you're just going to end up making the best archetype for all of them their starting archetypes on steroids, but locked to just them? Just seemed weird to me, like they had two different ideas for the class system, but couldn't commit to one or the other. Though, like I said before, I don't dislike what they done, I had fun engaging with it, I just believe it could have been better with a few tweaks. Now, my next two issues, which kind of go hand to hand and are probably my biggest disappointments with the entire game, has to do with the enemy and dungeon variety. Now, before you throw your pitchforks at me, I'm talking about some super pretty specific things in this regard. In terms of enemies, while I have zero issues with the actual combat variety when fighting enemies, I got pretty tired of seeing endless enemies reused all over the game. Even all the main human bosses that are the most unique enemies in the game are reused in the final dungeon. It's like, come on man, can I get some more original designs please? Then when it comes to dungeons, The side dungeons, to be specific, a lot of them had some pretty similar feels to them despite being so different to engage with mechanics wise. Like, all of them feel so squarish. Like, it's not an aesthetic thing necessarily, it's a layout thing. I don't know, they just didn't give me that feeling that some RPGs give, where you just get excited to explore a new place to see what the sights are like. So I guess it is an aesthetic thing then? At this point, I don't even know what to think. They could have been better. Moving on now. Let's get to something I feel a little more positive about, which is the calendar system, the main driving force of the story and metaphor, and what dictates how you approach the various aspects of the game.
Time marches on, and the age of a new king draws nearer.
Now, the calendar system dictates the story pace through the main objectives of the story thanks to deadlines you have to meet. Basically, as an example, the first deadline you get is you have to go through the Grand Cathedral dungeon and stop the necromancer Zorba from basically slaughtering countless innocent lives. Which, if you fail to do this before the deadline, you will basically get a game over. Now, how time passes in the system is based on what actions you take. For example, if you go to a dungeon during the day, whenever you decide to leave it, it will always turn to nighttime whether you return to a town or camp out. So you can't do anything else till the next day since your party is too tired from exploring the dungeon, unlike pretty much all other activities. Which they all pretty much allow you to still do something at night, but there's a very good chance you may have to leave and return to a dungeon multiple times to get through it, since at least early on in the game, definitely on harder difficulties, you most likely won't have the resources to recover your magic power you spend in battle to use skills, or even maybe the resources to recover your health, since these things don't automatically recover between battles. Luckily though, when it comes to dungeons, you will come across these areas called mag hollows that act as checkpoints and save rooms. So when you return to a dungeon, you can continue from any of those mag hollows instead of the very beginning of a dungeon. Now, as for other things that can pass the time while hanging out in cities, you can build bonds with your companions that give you a variety of benefits in and out of battle based on their bond level that is super easy to increase. You can fight in a coliseum, cook, spend time with NPCs, and take it easy to build your royal virtues, which are basically social stats that give you access to certain side quests when you unlock them based on their levels. You also have your main means of travel, which will pass time when using it, called the Gauntlet Runner. Basically, how this works is depending on how far a destination is, you may have to spend a few days traveling and camping out at night on the Gauntlet Runner, since traveling at night is too dangerous with it, but there's a variety of activities you can do while on it similar to what you do in the cities, but there's additional things that you can do that are exclusive to it, like raise your max HP or a companion's max MP. Now, obviously, having a system like this can feel very taunting because of time restraints with the deadlines. Definitely with the looming weather system that can make enemies more powerful and not give extra actions even when you attack them with their weaknesses. But once you get into the flow of metaphor, you will realize that the game gives you so much time to get this stuff done with endless quality of life things that you will never feel stressed out. Just for a few examples on what I mean by this, you can get a passive that makes cooking not pass time. You can get the ability to control weather in a location. While traveling in the Gauntlet Runner might seem to really chew through the days at first, later on when you unlock fast travel with it, which is also incorporated into the story with a great explanation, you truly get this feeling of freedom at a point where almost nothing feels urgent anymore in a good way. How they masterfully crafted the flow of the story, side content, and calendar system all together is truly amazing. But I think I'm getting a little too positive again, so let's balance this video out with what is my final complaint with metaphor. While I pretty much had zero issues playing the game on the PS5 performance-wise and think artistically the game looks incredible, from the crazy detailed UI to how they use fixed camera angles to set up shots to capture the scale in tension before boss fights, or even show off the flair of the various cities and shops within them, I was disappointed in the music variety. Like, don't get me wrong, the music tracks that are in the game are absolutely amazing, but so many fights in the game felt like they deserved their own soundtrack. Like, each main boss of the story could have used their own track to fit the theme of the area you fought through to get to them. I know this is me nitpicking, but if there's one thing that goes hand in hand with an RPG, it's cool special music tied to a boss fight. Luckily, the fights with Luis had its own special track that simply made those fights against him cooler. Now with all that said, would I recommend Metaphor? Abso-fucking-lutely. This is one of the best RPGs I've played. The approach to a more mature storytelling that isn't scared to dive deep into topics like racism and politics is amazing. The combat is engaging and challenging at times, with some pretty strong difficulty spikes that make you respect the mechanics. The characters are easily some of the best written I've seen in a video game, period. So, minus some issues I had, this for me is about as flawless as a game can get. It's not perfect because there's no such thing as perfect with any video game. All of them are flawed in one way or another, but I can without a doubt say I didn't regret a single second I played Metaphor.